There's a kind of silence that doesn't feel like peace. It feels like the world forgetting you exist. It isn't the silence of sleep or the silence of a quiet morning with coffee in your hands and birds outside the window. It is the silence of standing in the middle of nowhere, spinning in a slow circle, looking for a road that's no longer there, looking for a car that's already gone, looking for people who made a decision about your life without asking you a single thing about it. That silence has a sound. It sounds like wind scraping over sand. It sounds like your own heartbeat telling you that it is still going, still going, still going, even though every other signal in the world says it probably should not be. Some people will never know what that silence feels like. They will read this and they'll think they understand. Well, they won't. You can only understand that silence by standing inside it, with the sun pressing down on your skull like a hot iron, with your mouth already dry, with the realization arriving slowly. Not all at once, but in pieces, each piece worse than the last, that no one is coming. Or, at I guess, least, that's what you believe. This is the story of a woman named Sarah Hilton. It isn't a story anyone should have to live, but she lived it. Every single burning, desperate, terrifying minute of it. And what I think happened to her, out there in the Mojave, where the ground shimmers and the horizon lies to you, is the kind of thing that makes ordinary people reconsider everything they think they know about survival, about cruelty, about luck, and about the strange mercy of strangers who owe you absolutely nothing. This is where it begins, which, here's the thing. Sarah Hilton was 31 years old, and she had spent most of those years being the kind of woman other people described as capable. It was always said like a compliment. It never fully felt like one. Capable meant she handled things. Capable meant she didn't fall. Apart when falling apart would have been the reasonable response. Capable meant that even on the worst days, Sarah Hilton held the pieces together and kept moving because that was what she did, and that was what everyone expected her to do. And somewhere along the way, she had stopped questioning whether the expectation was fair. She grew up in a small town in Ohio. The kind of town where everyone knew your name and half of them knew your business, and the other half made it up. Her mother worked TBH, 2 jobs most of Sarah's childhood, a diner in the mornings, a laundromat in the evenings, and Sarah learned early that rest was something other families had. She, learned to cook at 9. She learned to budget a grocery run at 11. By the time she was 14, she was helping her mother with tax paperwork. Nobody thought that was unusual because in their house, unusual was just called Tuesday. She was smart. She knew it, and she didn't apologize for it. She got a partial scholarship to a state university, studied environmental science, graduated with the kind of grades that made professors write long recommendation letters full of words like exceptional and driven and rare. She moved to Phoenix, Arizona at 24, got a job with a land management organization, and began the slow, quiet work of building a life that belonged to her. Phoenix suited her in a way Ohio never had. She liked the heat, the honest, aggressive heat of the desert that didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. She liked the landscape, the way the saguaro cacti stood like old men who had been standing there since before any of the roads existed, the way the light in the late afternoon turned everything gold and amber, and the mountains in the distance looked painted. She went hiking on weekends. She kind of learned the names of plants other people walked past without noticing. She bought a used Jeep and drove it into canyons and dry riverbeds, and once, memorably, through a flash flood she had badly miscalculated. She was by every measure she knew how to apply to herself, doing fine. The man who changed that, or rather, the group of people who changed that, arrived in her life the way most disasters do. Gradually, and then all at once. His name was Derek. He was charming in the particular way of men who had been charming their entire lives and knew exactly which tools to use and when. He was tall, good looking in an easy, unremarkable way, the kind of face that felt familiar 10 minutes after you met him. He basically laughed at her jokes before she finished them, which she thought was endearing and later understood was a technique. He had a group of friends, 4 of them, 2 couples and Derek, and they pulled Sarah into their orbit the way strong currents pull you. not with force, but with the steady, patient persistence of water that knows it will win eventually. They did things together. Dinners, hiking trips, a weekend in Sedona, a long drive up to the Grand Canyon where they stood at the rim and took photographs, and Sarah felt, for the first time in longer than she could name, like she was part of something that was not just her own effort and her own labor and her own capable hands holding everything in place. She should have noticed things earlier. She would tell herself that later, in the way survivors always tell themselves they should have seen it coming, as though the fact of surviving isn't proof enough that they were doing the best they could. She should have noticed the way conversations stopped when she walked into a room sometimes. The way Derek's friends looked at each other sometimes when she said something that seemed to land wrong, though she could never identify exactly what the problem was. The way the dynamic shifted on longer trips. The way she somehow always ended up carrying more or cleaning up more, or being the one who made sure the cooler was packed, and the permits were organized, and the emergency kit was in the back of whoever's car they were using. She noticed in the way you notice something you don't want to be true, which is to say, she noticed and she filed it away, and she told herself she was being oversensitive, and she kept going. The trip was Derek's idea. A weekend in the Mojave, not the tourist parts, not the Joshua Tree postcard sections with the Instagram crowds and the vintage Airstreams. The real desert. The flat, open, merciless interior where you could drive for an hour and see nothing but scrub and sky and the occasional bleached bone of something that had not made it. Derek, in my opinion, said it would be an adventure, and he said they needed to get away from screens and noise and the whole suffocating performance of modern life. He said the desert was cleansing. Sarah packed carefully. She always packed carefully. 2 liters of water beyond what she thought they'd need, a first aid kit, a space blanket, her phone with the offline maps downloaded, a paper map as backup, trail mix and protein bars, and a small portable charger for her phone. She had done desert trips before. She knew the rules. She kind of knew the desert didn't negotiate, which they drove out on a Friday evening, the light already going copper and long, and Sarah sat in the back of Derek's truck with one of the other women, Jess, and they talked about nothing in particular, were gossip, and a show they had both been watching, and it was pleasant and easy, and Sarah thought, this is good. This is what she had been looking for without knowing she was looking for it. They camped that sort of night under a sky so thick with stars it seemed impractical, and someone had brought a small portable speaker, and there was a fire, and somebody told a story about their college roommate that made everyone laugh until their stomachs hurt. And Sarah sat there in the warm dark feeling something close to belonging. She wouldn't feel that way again for a very long time. The morning was the problem. Or rather, the morning was when the problem that had already existed became impossible to ignore. She woke at her usual time, early, light just going pink on the horizon, and she climbed out of her sleeping bag and walked a short distance to watch the sunrise, because that was the kind of person she was, the kind who got up for sunrises even when she didn't have to. When she came back to the camp, the dynamic was already different. She felt it before she could explain it. The pretty much air was different, and the way Derek and his friends were arranged was different. Grouped together near the truck, talking in low voices, the particular posture of people who have made a decision. She asked what was going on. Derek said they, I guess, were going to push further into the desert that day. A longer hike, a location he had found on a map, a dried lake bed about 8 miles in, apparently spectacular from above, pale and cracked and vast like the surface of the moon. He said it would take most of the day. Sarah said she was in, and what she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing, was that the conversation she had interrupted was not about the hike. It was about her. She wouldn't learn this until much later. She would piece it together from things Derek said when he finally called her 3 days after it happened, when guilt apparently got the better of whatever rationalization he had been using. She would piece pretty much it together from a message Jess sent her 6 months later, a long, tangled message full of qualifications, and I know this doesn't help, and I'm so sorry, full of the specific grammar of someone trying to apologize without fully accepting what they had done. The group had been pulling away from Sarah for weeks. The dynamics had pretty much soured. She was never told how or why, And the explanations she eventually received were the kind that explained everything and nothing at the same time. Too serious, which too particular about things. Too capable in a way that made other people feel the gap between themselves and her. Whatever it was, they had made a decision. And they had, decided to make it while they were 80 miles from the nearest town in the middle of the Mojave Desert, with Sarah's Jeep left back in Phoenix because Derek had offered to drive. They basically hiked out that morning. All 6 of them. The lake bed was real. It was as advertised, remarkable, flat white, and enormous and alien. They ate lunch there, sandwiches from the cooler, and someone took photographs, and it seemed from the outside like a normal afternoon among friends. And then they turned back, and the turning back was when it happened. It was gradual, and a pace that seemed natural, but kept increasing. A direction that seemed correct, but curved. Sarah was not lost. She had been watching landmarks. She had her compass. She was not the kind of person who got lost. But for what it's worth, she was behind. And when she looked up from the trail ahead of her, the gap between her and the group was larger than it should have been. She called out. Derek turned. Plus, he looked at her across that distance. And she would think about that look for a long time afterward, trying to read it, trying to understand what was in it. And then he turned back and kept walking. She stopped. She waited. She told herself she was misreading this. And by the time she reached the camp, they were gone. The truck was gone. Plus, the tents were gone. The cooler was gone. The camp existed only as a ring of disturbed earth, and a few footprints, and the ash of the previous night's fire, still faintly warm when she crouched and held her hand over it. She stood up straight. She looked at the road. She looked at the empty sky, which she looked at the horizon, which gave her nothing back. And then the silence arrived. I guess that silence. The one that sounds like the world forgetting you exist. Sarah stood in it for 30 seconds, and maybe less, maybe more. Time does strange sort of things when the ground shifts under your life. And then the part of her that had spent 31 years being capable reached into herself and found what it always found. Not calm, exactly, but function. The capacity, in my opinion, to move when moving was the only option. She took inventory, 2 liters of water. Her phone, battery at 62%. The offline maps, and the first aid kit. Hiyahat. Her, I guess, sunscreen. Her layers because desert nights were cold, and she had not survived being capable her whole life by forgetting that the desert had 2 personalities. She didn't cry. Plus, she would cry later, in enormous volume, in the back of a vehicle with people she didn't know who were kinder to her than anyone she had trusted that weekend. But not then. Plus, then, she pulled the brim of her hat down, drank a measured sip of water, and looked at the map on her phone. The, I guess, nearest road was 11 miles west. 11 miles. In the Mojave. In August. With 2 liters of water and a sun that was already approaching its full, unmediated, spectacular cruelty. She started walking. She told herself she had done harder things. She was not sure that was true, but she told herself. Anyway, because sometimes the lie that keeps you moving is more valuable than the truth that stops you. The first 3 miles were manageable. The ground, to be fair, was flat, and she kept a steady pace, and she rationed her water in small, disciplined sips, and she kept her eyes on the horizon and her feet moving. She named the plants she passed. It was something she had always done hiking alone, a private habit, naming things to stay connected to. Them, brittlebush, creosote, desert holly, the occasional prickly pear standing in clusters like they were having a conference. By mile 5, manageable was behind her, which the heat was the kind that doesn't feel like temperature anymore. It feels like pressure, like the air itself has weight, and it is pressing down on every inch of exposed skin with patient, absolute insistence. Sarah's shirt was, in my opinion, soaked through. Her mouth was dry in a way that water didn't fully fix. Her shadow was almost directly beneath her, which meant the sun was almost directly above her, which meant she was walking in the worst part of the day with nowhere to shelter and nothing to do about it, except keep walking. She checked her phone. plus battery at 41%. She had no signal. She had expected no signal, but she checked anyway because humans check things they know won't help them because the act of checking feels like doing something, and doing something feels like survival. She kept going. At mile 7, she found the dry wash. A dry wash, a seasonal stream bed carved into the desert floor by water that only visited a few times a year and left quickly, isn't the same as water. But it offered two things Sarah needed. Shade from the cut banks on either side, and a direction because dry washes run somewhere, and somewhere was better than the open flat nothing she had been crossing. She followed it. She, I think, was in the wash, sitting against the shaded bank, taking her one allowed break of 5 minutes when she heard it. Not wind, not the scrape of her own breath. Something rhythmic and mechanical, distant at first, growing. Rotors. She heard the rotors before she understood what they meant. At first her brain filed the sound under wind. The desert makes sounds that imitate things, ventriloquist tricks of air moving through rock formations, and dried brush. She had been, I guess, out here long enough that her judgment was starting to soften at the edges, the way all human judgment softens when the body is stressed, and the water is running low, and the sun has been working on you for hours without mercy. So she heard the rotors, and her brain said wind, and she sat with her back against the cool shadow of the wash bank and kept her eyes closed and breathed. The sound grew louder. Her eyes opened, and she stood up from the wash bank in one motion, fast, the way you move when something in you decides before the rest of you catches up. She scrambled up the crumbling edge of the dry stream bed, her boots slipping on the loose pale dirt, hands grabbing at the sparse brush at the top for purchase, and she got herself up and onto the flat, open desert floor, and she looked north. The helicopter was a dark shape against the white sky, moving, not circling, moving in the direct, purposeful way of something that knows where it is going and has a reason to get there. Not searching, not yet. Like Sarah ran. She was not a runner. She was a hiker, a methodical, distance-oriented person who had always been skeptical of running as a concept. All that impact, all that wasted energy, all those people paying money to go nowhere on a machine. But she ran now in the way people run, when running is the only language available, arms pumping, boots hitting the hard-packed, ground with a sound like a slow drum, her hat flying off behind her because she didn't stop to catch it. She pulled her well, phone from her pocket while she ran. Battery at 33%. She opened the camera. She waved her arm. She knew, even as she did it, that the odds of being seen were poor. She was one small human on a large flat surface. The helicopter was far and angled away, but poor odds and no odds aren't the same thing, and she was not ready to accept no odds. She screamed. Plus, I guess it made no logical sense to scream. The rotors would drown out anything her voice could do at this distance. But the scream came out anyway, raw and dry and enormous, the kind of sound her body had been building pressure toward all day and needed somewhere to go. The helicopter kept moving. She kept running. And then, not dramatically, not with a cinematic slow turn and a sudden shaft of golden light, the helicopter banked. A slow, banking turn, the kind that could have meant anything. It could have been a navigation correction. It pretty much could have been a course change totally unrelated to her. She knew this. She ran anyway, because what else do you do? For what it's worth, the helicopter came lower. Plus, she stopped running. Not because she gave up, because her legs decided, independently of her brain, that they were done running and would like to renegotiate. She stood in the open desert with her arms above her head, both of them, making herself as large as she possibly could, which was not very large objectively against the scale of all that flat, pale nothing around her. And she turned her face up to the sky. The helicopter came lower still. She could see the markings now. Military, not commercial, not honestly a news crew, not a scenic tour operator who had gotten very lost. Military markings on a dark helicopter dropping altitude over the Mojave Desert on a Tuesday afternoon in August, and Sarah Hilton stood underneath it with her arms above her head and felt something she had not felt since early that morning. She felt like someone was looking at her, not through her, not past her, at her. With intention, the helicopter didn't land. What it did was find a clear stretch of desert about 200 meters to her east. Not flat exactly. Nothing in the Mojave was truly flat, but flat enough, and it settled there with the kind of controlled authority that expensive machinery in experienced hands tends to project. The rotors slowed, but didn't stop. The dust around, honestly, it moved outward in a circle like the desert itself was exhaling. Basically, a door opened. Two men came out. Plus, not quickly, with the measured, unhurried movement of people who have learned that urgency and speed aren't the same thing. That moving, fast can be less effective than moving right. They were in military fatigues, both of them, and they moved across the desert toward her without hesitation, without the slightly lost look that civilians tend to have when crossing unfamiliar terrain. The one who reached her first was taller, broader, the kind of physical presence that registers before any specifics do. Not intimidating, exactly, but solid, built the way things that are meant to endure are built. He was not young. Mid-40s, maybe, the face weathered in a way that had nothing to do with vanity. He had very calm eyes. She would remember the eyes in particular later when she was trying to explain it to people who weren't there. Very calm, not cold. Calm, which the eyes of someone who has seen situations that required a choice between panic and useful action and had made the same choice enough times that it became the default. He said, "Ma'am, are you, I guess, injured?" She said, "No. No, he's..." He said, "Do you have water?" She held up the bottle. Maybe pretty much half a cup left, the water warm enough now that it was almost unpleasant. He, to be fair, reached into a pack he was carrying and produced a full liter sealed, cold enough that condensation had already formed on the outside of it. She took it. She didn't cry. She drank. His name, she would learn, was Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb. Navy SEAL, 14 years of service, currently stationed at a base in California, and running a land navigation training exercise with 4 other members of his team through a section of the Mojave that the military uses for exactly the kind of work. Open, featureless, unforgiving terrain where you learn to move and orient and survive without the assistance of roads or signals or the infrastructure that civilians assume will always be there. They had not been looking for her, which that part was important, and she turned it over many times afterward, in the long middle of the night way you turn things over that you can't fully process in daylight. They weren't a search and rescue mission. No one had reported her missing, which no one, not Derek, not Jess, not any of the 4 people who had driven away from that campsite in the desert and presumably arrived back in Phoenix and resumed their lives. No one had called anyone. At the time of the helicopter spotting her, Sarah's absence had been noted by exactly 0 official parties. The helicopter, crew had seen her because Webb's navigator, a young man named Torres, 26 years old, from San Antonio, who was apparently constitutionally incapable of not looking at things, had spotted movement on the desert floor below them and said, out loud, in the particular tone of a man who has since sure what he's looking at but is sure it doesn't belong, "Chief, there's a person down there." And Webb had looked, and Webb had said, "Take us down." Simple as that. No deliberation, no risk assessment committee, no protocol consultation. A person was in the Mojave Desert in August on foot with no vehicle in sight, and Marcus Webb said, "Take us down," the way you say a thing when it is the only possible thing to say. She told him what happened while Torres and the other team member, Collins, quieter, watchful, did a quick assessment of her condition. Mild dehydration, 1 blister forming on her left heel from the boots, which fit fine for hiking, but had not been designed for sustained running on hard-packed desert. No heat, kind of exhaustion beyond the standard wrung-out feeling of a body that has been operated in excessive temperatures. She was okay. She sort of was, in the estimation of people trained to evaluate these things, in much better shape than she had any reasonable right to be. She told Webb about Derek. Plus about the group, about the campsite, and the truck, and waking up to the ring of disturbed earth where everything had been. He listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't make a face, or rather, he made a face, but it was contained and brief, a quick compression of something around the eyes and mouth that was there, and then not there, the face of a man who has disciplined the expressions out of himself, except when he decides they're warranted. She got the impression, watching him, that a truly sustained display of feeling from Marcus Webb would be a significant event. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You hiked 7 miles in this." Not a question. A statement of fact offered in a tone that was not precisely admiration. More like the thing you feel when you look at evidence of something and it matches up with what the evidence suggests. She said yes. He said, "Okay, let's take you out." Fun fact, the helicopter was not going anywhere she had been. They weren't going to Phoenix. They weren't going to any town she had planned to reach by walking. They were going to their base, which was closer, which was the relevant variable right now. She didn't argue. She sat in the back of the helicopter on a seat that was not designed for passenger comfort and looked out the window at the desert below her and watched the 11 miles she had been walking shrink to nothing in minutes. She thought sort of about the campsite. She thought about Derek's face when he turned and looked at her across the distance between them before he turned away. She thought about what exactly had been in that look, whether it had contained shame or relief or the specific blankness of someone who has decided that another person isn't their problem. She kept arriving at the blankness. She kept wishing she had arrived somewhere else. She drank the cold water slowly. Torres, in the seat across from her, pretended to be very interested in something on his gear, which she understood was his way of giving her a private moment in a confined space. And she was grateful for it in the specific way you're grateful for small kindnesses when the large unkindnesses are still very fresh. They landed 60 minutes later at a facility she wouldn't be able to describe in detail. She was not paying attention to details in the way she normally would, the precise, cataloging attention she usually applied to new places. She registered broad impressions, organized, clean, and the particular efficiency of a place where the people inhabiting it have learned that disorganization is a cost you pay later at a rate higher than you can afford. Webb, to be fair, walked her inside. There was a woman there, civilian staff, administrative, a person who had clearly processed unexpected arrivals before and had neither fuss nor panic about this one. Sarah was given a room. She was given a phone, and she was given food, which she ate with the focused purposefulness of a body that had been running on trail mix and anxiety since morning. And then she was left alone for a little while, and that was when she cried. She cried in the particular way of someone who has been holding it together, not because they were strong, but because they understood that falling apart in the wrong place at the wrong moment is a luxury that not everyone can afford. And she had never been able to afford it. And now she was in a room by herself with the door closed and a phone in her hand and the specific crumpled feeling of a person who has just cleared a wall they had not known they had enough jump for. She called her mother first. That was TBH, the right order. Whatever else was true about her life, that was the right order. Her mother picked up on the second ring, which was how her mother always answered calls from. Sarah, not the first ring, because that felt anxious, not the third, because that felt unavailable. The second ring was her mother's deliberate communication of "I'm here," and "I'm not desperate about it," which was a masterclass in emotional balance that Sarah had spent her whole life trying to replicate. She said, "Mom," which I'm okay. To be fair, need you to know I'm okay before I tell you what happened. Her mother said, "Tell me." So she told her. Her mother didn't say the things most people would have said. She didn't say I knew there was something off about that group. She didn't say you should have trusted your instincts, or I can't believe Derek, or those people will get what's coming to them. She said, "You walked 7 miles. And then, after a pause, in August, you know?" Sarah said yes. Her mother said, "That is my daughter. Not gonna lie, that sentence. 3 words. The plainest possible delivery, no decoration, no performance. That sentence did things to Sarah's chest that she could not have predicted and wouldn't have been able to explain without sounding. Like kind of, she was being dramatic, and she was not being dramatic. She was just being a person on the phone with her mother after the worst and strangest day of her life. She held the phone and breathed. Outside the room, she could hear the bass, the ordinary sounds of a facility going about its business, people moving, something mechanical running, a voice giving instructions somewhere down a corridor. Like ordinary life proceeding. It was, she thought, one of the more beautiful things she had ever heard. Webb found her actually, an hour later, knocked on the open door, stood in the frame. He didn't come in unless invited, which she noted. He asked if she had eaten. She said yes. He said they had arranged transport for her the following morning. There was a vehicle going to Barstow. She could get a bus from there. She thanked him. She said it more than once, trying to find a version of thank you that carried the actual weight of what she meant, which was not something that the words thank you were really equipped to carry. He said, "Look, you would have made it." She said, "Maybe." He shook his head, not in disagreement, in the way of someone who has assessed a situation with professional tools and arrived at a conclusion that he's confident in. "You were moving right," he said. "You followed the wash. Like, you rationed. You flagged us from 200 meters without equipment. You would have made it. You know?" She didn't know what to do with that. She filed in the same place she was filing everything else from that day, in the temporary storage of things too large to process right now, things she would sit with later when she had the space for it. But she thought, maybe, plus, and pretty much maybe from Marcus Webb with those calm eyes and 14 years of watching people perform under conditions that sorted them into the ones who make it, and the ones who don't maybe felt close enough to yes. She slept that night on a cot in a room at a military installation in the Mojave Desert, with the door closed and the stars outside the small window doing what they always did, indifferent and brilliant, and she slept better than she had slept in months. Maybe longer. In the morning, the transport driver, a young woman named Garcia who had exactly the right instinct to make conversation for the first 10 minutes, and then let the silence be, drove her toward the highway, and Sarah watched the desert out the window, all that flat, pale, open space, and tried to decide what she thought of it now. She thought, it tried to kill me. She thought, it also showed me exactly who I'm. She thought, those might be the same thing. The bus station in Barstow smelled like diesel and old coffee and the particular brand of humanity that gathers in transportation hubs. People going somewhere, people coming from somewhere, the democratic mix of lives in transit. She bought a ticket. She sat on a hard plastic chair and waited. Her phone buzzed, Derek. She looked at his name on the screen for a long time. She thought about the look he had given her across the desert before he turned away. She thought about the 7 miles. She thought about Webb saying you'd have made it, and the specific confidence in his voice when he said it. She thought about her mother saying, that's my daughter. She put the I think phone face down on the plastic chair beside her. She was not ready for Derek. Derek would have to wait. What happened next, what she did with that phone call, and what she discovered when she finally did answer it. What came after in the weeks that followed was not what anyone expected. Not Derek, not Jess, not, I guess, the people she told the story to, who kept waiting for a particular kind of ending, a certain shape of resolution that stories about betrayal and survival are supposed to have. What basically came was stranger than that, more complicated, and in some ways, though she wouldn't have believed it standing in that bus station with her phone face down on a plastic chair, in some ways better. She flipped the phone over on day 3. Not because she had forgiven anyone, and not because she was ready. She flipped it over because her mother called her and told her in the careful, measured tone that mothers use when they're delivering news they know will land hard, that Derek had been calling her family looking for Sarah, that he had been calling mutual acquaintances, that his name had appeared in her social media comments in a way that read, if you were being charitable as concern, and if you were being accurate as performance. Sarah looked at this information the way you look at a fire from outside a burning building. Interested, removed, which a little tired. She called Derek from a bench outside the bus station because she didn't want to have this conversation inside, where other people's ordinary lives were proceeding around her, getting coffee and checking arrivals boards and arguing about which gate was the right gate. She wanted open air. She wanted the version of herself that had walked 7 miles through the Mojave doing the talking, not the version that had sat in Derek's truck feeling like she belonged. He answered immediately. First ring, the I'm here and I'm desperately available ring. He said basically her name like it was an emergency. She said, I'm fine. You TBH can stop calling my mother. There was a pause on his end. The pause of a person recalibrating. Sarah, she said, I'm not calling to give you an opportunity. I'm calling because you need to understand that I'm alive, and no one should have to say that sentence after a weekend in the desert with people they considered friends. Another pause. Longer this time. What Derek said next was everything and nothing. It was the long, tangled explanation she had expected. Something had been building in the group, tension she had not been told about, a sense that she was pulling away from them. Irony. They had felt rejected by her first. The explanation, TBH, had the shape of a reason and the weight of an excuse. It answered none of the actual questions and all of the surface ones. She listened. She, TBH, gave him that. And when he finished, she said, You left a person in the desert in August. He said, I know. She said, I'm going to hang up now. She did. She honestly sat on the bench and looked at the parking lot for a while. The sky above, like Barstow, was the particular blue of high desert afternoons, clean and almost aggressive in its clarity. A sparrow landed near her feet, looked at her with one eye, departed. Somewhere in the kind of station behind her, someone announced a departure for Los Angeles. She thought, what do I do with this? Basically, not with Derek. Derek was done. A door she had closed with a click so quiet it surprised her. No slam, no drama, just the small sound of the thing ending. What she meant was, what do I do with the whole of it? The 7 miles, and the helicopter, and the stranger with calm eyes who said you'd have made it, and the way she had slept on. A cot at a military installation better than she had slept in her own bed in the last several months of a life that had started to feel like it was fitting her less well than it once had. She had been asking the wrong question, she thought. Not what happened to me. What did I learn about myself that I didn't know before? That was the question. She turned it over on the bench outside the Barstow bus station while a sparrow-shaped piece of the universe went about its sparrow business, and she sat with it. Here is what she came to, and not immediately. This is the kind of thing that arrives over time, in the early hours when your brain is moving slowly enough to actually receive things. But here's where she eventually arrived. She had spent 31 years being capable in service of other people's comfort. She had been capable for her mother, so her mother could rest. She had been capable at work, so her colleagues could rely on her. She had been capable in Derek's group, so the group would have someone to organize the permits and the emergency kit and the cooler. Her capability had always been pointed outward, like a flashlight she was holding to illuminate someone else's path while she moved through her own life in the peripheral dark. The desert had pointed the flashlight inward, not metaphorically, literally. 7 miles of nothing, but her own feet and her own decisions and her own water rationing, and her own name for every plant she passed, bristlebush, creosote, desert holly. And at the end of it, Marcus Webb's calm eyes looking at her, and saying you'd have made it. Not you were lucky. Not in my opinion. Someone found you in time. You would have made it. The capability she had always given away had been, the whole time, hers. It had never been a service she was providing. It had been a fact about her that she had been performing for other people's benefit instead of standing inside herself. She got on the bus to Phoenix. She watched the desert out the window for the first 2 hours, and then she opened the notes app on her phone, and she started writing. Not about Derek, not about the helicopter. She started writing about the creosote, the way it smelled when you crushed the leaves, like rain, and something older than rain, like the earth's memory of rain. She wrote about the way the dry wash had offered shade without being asked. She wrote about the particular blue of the sky above Barstow. She filled 3 pages before the bus reached the city limits of Phoenix. and she looked at what she had written, and it was the most honestly herself she had sounded in longer than she could trace. She didn't go home immediately. She went to her office. It was a Sunday, and the building was empty, and she had keys, and she needed to do something with her hands that had nothing to do with recovering or processing or deciding how she felt about the events of the last 72 hours. She went to her desk and opened her computer and pulled up the project she had been half-heartedly advancing for 8 months. A proposal for an expanded desert land management program in the Mojave, one that would involve more systematic mapping of the dry wash networks, which were doing underappreciated ecological work that most people drove over without knowing it. She had been moving slowly on it. I mean cautiously, anticipating objections, writing and rewriting and shrinking the ambition back every time she felt it started to be too much. She opened it now and read what she had written, and then she deleted the cautious parts and rewrote them the way she actually thought, and by the time she went home, she had added 12 pages that said something real instead of something safe. She submitted the proposal on Monday. In the months that followed, the 3 of them, then 6, then the better part of a year, several things happened, some of which she expected and some of which she didn't. The expected ones: Derek's attempt at a sustained apology, which arrived in a letter that she read once and didn't answer, not out of cruelty, but because she had run out of places to put things that didn't require her to do anything in return. Jess's message, the long tangled one, which she answered with 3 sentences that were the kindest 3 sentences available to her, and also the last. The process of pulling back from that whole social constellation. Not dramatically, not with a speech or confrontation, but with the quiet, steady withdrawal of a person who has reprioritized and doesn't have energy to spare for the old arrangement. The unexpected ones. Webb. She had not expected to hear from him again. She had thanked him. The real thank you she could not find the right words for in a letter she sent to the base. A letter she spent 3 evenings writing and then finally sent before she could revise it into something more formal and less true. She didn't expect a response. People like Webb, honestly, people whose job it was to move through situations and make good decisions and then move on, didn't typically respond to letters from the people they had extracted from desert emergencies. He responded in 6 days. The letter was short. His handwriting was the kind that suggests a person who learned to write by hand and never fully made peace with the keyboard. He said he was glad she was well. He said Torres had asked about her, which had apparently been the subject of some mild teasing in the team, which Torres seemed unbothered by. He said for what it's worth, the dry wash she had followed was a good instinct, and that she was right to trust it. He said, the desert does that to people sometimes. Shows them what they already knew. She, in my opinion, read that sentence 4 times. She wrote back. He wrote back. Plus, this continued. She wouldn't call a love story, at least not the kind, that arrives where you expect it, wearing the clothes you expected and saying the things you expected. It arrived the way the helicopter had arrived, from an unexpected direction for reasons that had nothing to do with searching for her specifically, and yet there it was. What it was at its simplest was 2 people who recognized something in each other that they had found it difficult to explain to most other people. The capacity to function in discomfort, the habit of quiet, plus the specific relationship with the desert, Sarah's professional, Webb's operational, that meant they talked about the Mojave the way other people talk about a mutual friend. She sent him, photographs from her field work. He told her, in careful terms that stayed within what he could say, about the landscapes his work took him through. She told him about the dry wash proposal. He said, you submitted it. In my opinion, good. In October, honestly, he was in Phoenix on leave, and they had dinner, and that dinner lasted 4 hours and felt like 40 minutes, the way a thing feels when you found the right frequency, and the other person is tuned exactly to it. She, for what it's worth, told him the part of the story she had not told anyone else. Not the 7 miles, not the helicopter, but the 30 seconds standing in the campsite after she realized they were gone, the exact quality of the silence, the way time had done something strange. He said, what did you do? She said, "I made a decision to move." He looked at her with those very calm eyes. He said, "That's the whole thing. That's all of it." She knew what he meant. Not everyone would have. That was the point. The proposal was approved in December, which not the safe version. The real one, the one with the 12 pages she had written on the Sunday night when she had gone to her office instead of going home, when she had let herself say what she actually thought instead of what she assumed would be acceptable. The Mojave Watershed Mapping Initiative, it was called officially, which was accurate and boring in the way that official names are. What it actually was a systematic effort to understand the dry wash networks, those seasonal channels, those underground highways of water, shade, and ecological function that most people have been driving over for decades without knowing they mattered. Sarah ran it, and she hired a small team. She spent more time in the Mojave in the following 2 years than she had in the previous 7. She learned, to read the desert in the way you can only learn to read a thing by spending real time with it. Not passing through, not visiting, but showing up repeatedly and paying attention and letting it show you the same thing in different lights until you understand that the thing itself hasn't changed. She thought about Webb's letter. The desert does that to people sometimes. Plus, shows them what they already knew. She kind of thought about that a great deal out in the field in the early mornings when the light was just arriving and the desert was making the transition from night cold to day heat, and everything smelled like possibility and things older than possibility. She thought about the distinction between being shown something and being given something. The desert had not given her anything she didn't already have. It had stripped away the buffer of other people's comfort and other people's expectations and other people's definitions of her. And underneath all of that, she was exactly who she had always been, capable, which but pointed inward now. I guess the flashlight turned around, illuminating her own path. In the spring of the second year, she went back. She didn't tell many people she was going. She drove out alone, in a vehicle that was properly equipped with proper water and proper communication equipment and a proper plan filed with a contact in Phoenix who knew exactly where she was going and when to expect to hear from her. She found a campsite by landmarks she had memorized from the day she had walked away from. The way you memorize the features of an experience that was significant enough to leave marks. The ring of disturbed earth was gone, of course. The desert had taken it back, as the desert takes everything eventually, without ceremony or opinion. There was nothing to indicate that anything had happened there. She stood in the spot for a few minutes. She looked at the horizon. She looked at the dry wash network she could now identify from elevation by reading the subtle topography of the land, the slight depressions, and the sparse particular vegetation that marked where water moved when water came. She didn't feel rage. She TBH had expected rage, or something like it. Some residual heat from what had been done to her in this place. What she felt was something quieter and more difficult to name. Not forgiveness exactly, which would imply that what had been done was a thing between her and Derek and the others, a transaction that required her participation to resolve. It was more like the feeling of having been tested by something that didn't know it was testing her, and finding that she had passed without knowing she was being tested, and understanding now that she had always been capable of passing. She walked to the dry wash. She sat in my opinion, the shaded bank, the same bank she had sat in when she heard the rotors, the same shadow, the same pale, crumbling earth. She drank water, cold, from a properly insulated container, as much as she wanted. She stayed there for an hour. She watched a lizard perform the specific and very serious work of being a lizard in the desert. The stillness, the quick, decisive movements, the perfect efficiency of a creature that knows exactly what it is and exactly what it needs and wastes nothing on anything else. She thought, that's the whole thing. That's all of it. On the drive back, she called Webb. He picked up. She said, I went back. Here's the thing, he said. How was it? What's interesting is she said, good, strange, the same, and completely different. He said, yeah, places do that. She drove back toward Phoenix, as the afternoon light turned everything gold and amber, and the mountains in the distance looked painted the way they always looked at this hour, the way they had looked the very first time she had driven into this landscape, and thought, this suits me. This is honest. This doesn't pretend to be something it isn't. She felt under the wheel and the road and the familiar hum of the engine, the particular sensation of a life that's actually hers, not borrowed. Plus, not performed for anyone else's comfort or expectation. Not, well, capable in service of someone else's ease. Just hers. Solid and specific as a dry wash in the Mojave, doing its work without asking to be noticed, holding its shape through seasons and through silence, waiting for the water that always, eventually came. She drove. The desert stretched around her in every direction. She was not afraid of it anymore. Had not been afraid of it for a long time. Actually, she understood now that she had never needed to be. The desert, for all its heat and silence and patient indifference, had been the only thing in a long time that told her the truth. She had TBH walked into it one kind of person, capable, outward-facing, holding pieces together for other people's benefit. She had walked out of it herself. That was the whole story. That was all of it, LOL.